The transparent doors to the biology laboratory aboard the Xylos space station hissed open as Dr. Eris Thorne entered, his eyes immediately scanning the pristine, sterile environment. Unlike the laboratories he was accustomed to on Earth, this one gleamed with an almost painful cleanliness, every surface polished to perfection. The air carried a faint electrical charge, a byproduct of the constant sterilization field that the Cthar species maintained in all their medical and biological research facilities. Eris adjusted the collar of his research uniform, still not entirely comfortable with the slightly constricting design favored by his hosts. After 3 weeks aboard the Cthar-operated space station, he was still adapting to many aspects of their culture and scientific methodology. As an experienced field biologist from Earth, he had spent decades trudging through mud and undergrowth on various planets, collecting specimens with his bare hands. The rigidly controlled environment of the Xylos laboratory felt almost suffocating in comparison. "Greetings, Dr. Thorne. Your temporal punctuality is appreciated," came the precise, slightly mechanical voice of Instructor Xyler, the senior Cthar scientist overseeing the exchange program. Eris turned to face the alien researcher. Like all Cthar, Xyler stood nearly 7 feet tall, with a hard exoskeleton covering most of his body. The carapace gleamed with a bluish iridescence under the laboratory lights, a sign of his advanced age and status. Where humans had facial features, the Cthar had a complex arrangement of sensory nodules and speaking membranes, which now vibrated slightly as Xyler addressed him. "Good morning, Instructor," Eris replied with a polite nod. "I'm looking forward to examining the new plant samples today." Xyler's upper appendages made a series of precise gestures that Eris had come to recognize as the Cthar equivalent of formal acknowledgement. "My students await your input on the specimens retrieved from Proxima Centauri b yesterday. They're eager to observe your unconventional analytical methods." The slight pause wasn't lost on Eris. He knew that many of the Cthar scientists, Xyler included, found his hands-on approach to biology primitive and potentially dangerous. They prefer to interact with specimens through automated systems and microscopic manipulation fields, rarely making direct contact with biological material. As if on cue, 3 Cthar students entered from an adjacent room, each carrying specialized containment units. Eris had been working with them for the past week and was just beginning to distinguish their individual characteristics. Lyra, the smallest of the 3, had a lighter-colored carapace with distinctive green markings along her sensory ridge. She was inquisitive by Cthar standards, often asking questions that her peers considered obvious or unnecessary. Kale, by contrast, was a model Cthar student, methodical, protocol-adherent, and somewhat rigid in his thinking. His darker exoskeleton bore the polished sheen of meticulous self-maintenance. The third student, Rorik, was perhaps the most challenging to work with. His carapace had unusual ridges that Eris had learned indicated skepticism in Cthar body language, and he rarely missed an opportunity to question or challenge the human's methods. "We have prepared the specimens according to standard protocol," Kale stated, placing his containment unit on the central examination platform. "The flora samples demonstrate unusual adaptive properties when exposed to varying light wavelengths." Eris approached the platform, genuinely curious. "Let's take a closer look, shall we?" The containment unit's force field dissolved, revealing a collection of small, vibrant purple plants with star-shaped leaves. They pulsated slightly, responding to the laboratory's atmospheric conditions. "Fascinating," Eris murmured, reaching for a pair of specimen forceps. "These appear to be a form of photosynthetic organism, but the pigmentation suggests adaptation to a different light spectrum than we typically see. Our analysis indicates high levels of compound X42 delta in the cellular structure," Lyra offered, her voice carrying the slightly higher pitch that distinguished female Cthar. "It may be responsible for the unusual coloration and pulsation patterns." Eris nodded, carefully manipulating one of the plants with the forceps. "Good observation, Lyra. On Earth, we'd classify this as a potential photoactive defense mechanism. Many plants develop toxins or irritants to discourage consumption by herbivores." As he spoke, Eris maneuvered the plant to examine its root structure. Without warning, one of the star-shaped leaves unfurled explosively, releasing a tiny barbed spine that shot through the air and embedded itself deeply in the back of his right hand. "Ah!" he exclaimed, more in surprise than pain. He dropped the forceps and instinctively pulled back his hand, examining the injury. The spine, no larger than a splinter, had penetrated his skin completely. A small drop of blood welled up around it, but curiously, the normally red human blood had taken on a greenish tint where it contacted the spine. A localized reaction to the plant toxin, Eris muttered to himself, reaching to carefully extract the spine. Nothing serious, just... His calm assessment was interrupted by a shrill alarm that suddenly blared throughout the laboratory. Kale had activated an emergency medical alert at his workstation, his sensory nodules flaring with agitation. Biological contamination detected. Human researcher compromised, Kale announced, his voice pitched higher than normal. Emergency medical response required immediately. Eris looked up in surprise. "It's just a small puncture wound, Kale. There's no need for..." But the Cthar students were already executing emergency protocols. Rorik activated a containment field around the plant specimens, while Lyra approached with a medical scanner, holding it at what she clearly considered a safe distance from Eris. "Instructor Xyler, the human's circulatory fluid has changed color," she reported, her voice vibrating with what might have been concern. "And the scanner detects elevated histamine response and localized cellular distress." Before Eris could protest further, the laboratory doors slid open again to admit a team of Cthar medical personnel, led by Xyler himself, who had quickly donned protective gear. "Dr. Thorne," Xyler addressed him with formal urgency, "you will accompany us to the medical bay immediately. Your biological systems appear to be responding adversely to an unknown xenotoxin." "Really, this is unnecessary," Eris tried to explain as he was efficiently escorted from the laboratory. "It's a minor injury, similar to a bee sting or nettle contact on Earth. I just need to clean it and perhaps apply some antihistamine." His protests fell on unresponsive sensory nodules as the Cthar medical team guided him through the station's corridors. Passing crew members moved aside, their body language indicating alarm at the sight of the medical emergency team escorting the station's only human resident. The medical bay was a vast chamber dominated by a central diagnostic platform surrounded by an array of instruments that Eris found both fascinating and intimidating. Most Cthar medical technology focused on exoskeleton repair, internal fluid regulation, and neural pathway maintenance, all adapted to a physiology radically different from his own. "Please position yourself on the diagnostic platform," one of the medical technicians instructed, gesturing with precisely controlled appendages. Sighing in resignation, Eris complied, lying back on the slightly uncomfortable surface designed for Cthar anatomy. Immediately, a three-dimensional scanning field enveloped him, projecting detailed images of his hand's internal structure above the platform. Xyler and the students gathered around the display, their postures indicating intense concentration as they analyzed the data. "Diagnosis confirmed," Xyler announced after several moments. "Xenotoxin contamination, level 4 severity. Initial tissue necrosis detected with potential for vascular compromise. Recommended treatment: immediate surgical debridement, synthetic dermal graft, and full-spectrum systemic detoxification therapy." Eris sat up abruptly, startling the medical technicians. "What? Surgery? That's completely excessive. This is a minor puncture wound with a mild plant toxin. My immune system is already handling it." He held up his hand to demonstrate. True, the area around the puncture was red and slightly swollen, and the small amount of blood still had an unusual greenish tint, but it was far from a medical catastrophe the Cthar were describing. "With respect, Dr. Thorne," Xyler responded, his tone suggesting he believed Eris was in denial, "our diagnostic systems detect significant anomalies in your tissue response. The discoloration indicates cellular disruption consistent with progressive necrotic pathways." "That's just a normal inflammatory response," Eris insisted, trying to keep his growing frustration in check. Humans have a complex immune system specifically designed to handle foreign substances. The redness and swelling are signs that it's working, not failing. Kale stepped forward, his stance radiating what Eris had come to recognize as Cthar certainty. Our scans indicate elevated cytokine levels and abnormal capillary permeability. According to Cthar medical standards, these are clear indicators of critical tissue compromise. Eris took a deep breath. The cultural and biological gulf between them was becoming increasingly apparent. For the Cthar, with their protective exoskeletons, any breach was indeed serious. Their soft internal tissues had few natural defenses against outside contaminants. But human skin was designed as a semi-permeable barrier, working in concert with a sophisticated immune system to handle minor injuries and toxins. "I understand your concern," he said carefully, "but human physiology is fundamentally different from Cthar physiology. What will be dangerous for you is routinely manageable for us." He could see his words having little effect. The medical technicians were already preparing what appeared to be microsurgical equipment, while another was programming a synthesis unit, presumably for the dermal graft Zyler had mentioned. Lyra, who had been quietly observing the exchange, ventured a question. "Is it possible that Dr. Thorne's assessment has merit? Our knowledge of human emergency medicine is primarily theoretical." Zyler's sensory nodules contracted slightly. A gesture Eris had learned indicated dismissal. "The diagnostic data is conclusive. The toxin is producing effects that, if unchecked, will result in progressive tissue damage. Standard protocol for unknown xenotoxin exposure is clear." Eris realized that further verbal explanations would be futile. The Cthar respected data and procedure above all else, and his assurances counted for little against their scanner readings and established protocols. "Before we proceed," he said, adopting a more formal tone that he knew would resonate better with them, "I would like to retrieve my personal medical kit from my quarters. It contains human-specific biological markers that could serve as valuable control samples for your analysis of the toxin's effects." This approach, appealing to their scientific curiosity and data-gathering instincts, had the desired effect. After a brief consultation, Zyler nodded. "A logical precaution. Kale will accompany you to retrieve these materials. Please proceed efficiently, as treatment should commence within the optimal therapeutic window." Eris nodded, sliding off the diagnostic platform. With Kale following closely, he made his way to his quarters. The Cthar student maintained a respectful distance, his posture suggesting he was monitoring Eris for signs of deterioration. Inside his quarters, Eris quickly located his field medical kit, a compact but comprehensive collection of supplies that had accompanied him on countless research expeditions. He'd learned long ago that when studying alien ecosystems, being prepared for minor injuries was essential. "This contains standard human medical supplies," he explained to Kale, who was watching with what appeared to be suspicious interest, "including analyzers specifically calibrated to human physiology." Kale's sensory nodules vibrated slightly. "Such portable diagnostic equipment seems inadequate compared to our medical bay capabilities." Eris smiled slightly. "Sometimes simpler tools have their place. Shall we return?" Back in the medical bay, Eris noted that the surgical equipment was now fully prepared. A translucent field generator hovered above the diagnostic platform, ready to create a sterile microenvironment for the procedure. Various robotic appendages equipped with precision cutting and sealing tools waited nearby. All eyes, or rather, sensory nodules, turned to him as he entered. "I would like to demonstrate a standard Earth protocol for preliminary decontamination," Eris announced with an authority he didn't entirely feel but hoped would carry weight. "It may provide valuable comparative data for your records." Without waiting for explicit permission, but moving deliberately enough that he could be stopped if necessary, Eris opened his medical kit on a nearby surface. He extracted an antiseptic solution, a pair of fine tweezers, a small vial of antihistamine cream, and a suture kit containing a curved needle and self-dissolving thread. "I will now perform basic wound cleaning and closure," he narrated, aware that every Kthar in the room was watching with rapt attention. This is standard procedure for minor penetrating injuries with potential contaminants. With practiced movements, Eris thoroughly cleaned the wound with the antiseptic solution, ensuring no foreign material remained. He then carefully inspected the puncture site with the tweezers, extracting a tiny fragment of the plant spine that had broken off beneath his skin. "Secondary contaminant removed," he commented, placing the fragment in a small sample container from his kit. "This can be analyzed later for complete toxin profiling." Next, and to the visible shock of his audience, Eris swiftly threaded the curved needle and proceeded to place 3 neat stitches to close the small wound. The entire process took less than 2 minutes, his movements efficient from years of having to treat his own minor injuries in the field. Finally, he applied a small amount of antihistamine cream to the area and covered it with a transparent adhesive dressing. "Procedure complete," he announced, looking up to meet the collective gaze of the Nithar medical team. "The wound is now clean, closed, and protected. The natural human healing process can proceed optimally, and my immune system will neutralize any remaining toxin." For several long moments, absolute silence filled the medical bay. The Kthar stood motionless, their normal subtle movements completely stilled in what Eris had come to recognize as extreme surprise or shock. Kale was the first to break the silence, his voice containing unfamiliar harmonics that the translation system rendered as disbelief. "Self-destructive behavior. Primitive invasive technique. Without proper molecular tissue mapping." Rorik had physically backed away, his posture suggesting either disgust or alarm. Lyra remained closer, her sensory nodules fully extended in what appeared to be intense scientific curiosity mixed with horror. Xyler finally stepped forward, his voice stern. "Dr. Thorne, what you have just done constitutes a severe violation of medical safety protocols. You have deliberately interfered with a potentially high-risk injury using unauthorized methods." Eris met the instructor's gaze steadily. "With respect, Instructor Xyler, this wasn't self-destruction but basic first aid. The wound is clean and closed. I only need a mild antihistamine to reduce the localized reaction to the toxin, and it will heal completely within days." He gestured to his hand, with a dressing allowed the stitched wound to remain visible. "These are self-dissolving sutures. As the tissue heals, they'll be naturally absorbed by my body. It's a standard technique humans have used for centuries." "Centuries?" Rorik interjected, his tone suggesting he found this difficult to believe. "You mean this is not even current human medical technology?" Eris shook his head. "For minor wounds, sometimes the simplest approaches are still the most effective. The key principles: clean the wound, remove foreign material, close it to prevent infection, and support the body's natural healing, haven't changed much over time." Xyler gestured for one of the medical technicians to approach with a scanner. "We must reassess the tissue status after this." Intervention. The technician held the device over Eris's hand, and new images appeared above the diagnostic platform. The Kthar studied them intently, their body language suggesting confusion. "The inflammatory markers remain elevated," Xyler noted, "but they appear contained to the immediate wound area. There is no indication of progressive necrosis, and toxin levels are minimal around the suture placement." The last word seemed difficult for the Kthar to articulate, as if the concept itself was alien to their medical understanding. "The scanner confirms what I described," Eris said gently. "The wound has been physically closed, and my immune system is already processing the toxin. The inflammation will gradually decrease over the next 24 to 48 hours." Xyler's upper appendages moved in a gesture that Eris interpreted as reluctant acceptance. "You will remain under close observation. I am ordering hourly biological scans to monitor for delayed systemic reactions." The instructor still didn't fully trust Eris's explanation, but the scanner data no longer supported the need for emergency surgery. As the group began to disperse, the students remained clearly full of questions. Lyra approached first, her movements cautious but her curiosity evident. "Dr. Thorne, "May I inquire about the contents of your primitive medical kit?" she asked, sensory nodules directed toward the small container still open on the surface. "Of course," Eris replied, grateful for her interest. "It's designed for field use, containing essentials for treating common injuries when advanced medical facilities aren't available." Kale had moved closer as well, though his posture remained stiff. "I'm attempting to correlate your actions with known psychological models. Self-administered needle penetration contradicts normal self-preservation instincts." Eris suppressed a smile. "It might seem counterintuitive, but it's actually deeply aligned with self-preservation. By closing the wound quickly and cleanly, I'm preventing potential contamination and supporting faster healing." Rorik maintained his distance, but offered his own assessment. "This outcome may be temporary. The toxin could still be circulating in your system, accumulating in vital organs." "That's a reasonable concern," Eris acknowledged, "but human detoxification systems are remarkably efficient. My liver and kidneys will filter any toxin that enters my bloodstream, and a localized immune response will neutralize most of it at the source." He gestured to his hand. "If you're interested, we could take regular samples to track how my body processes the toxin. It might provide some valuable comparative data on human versus Cthar immune responses." This suggestion, framing his self-treatment as an opportunity for scientific observation, seemed to shift the atmosphere. Even Rorik moved slightly closer, his skepticism now tinged with reluctant scientific curiosity. Over the next 24 hours, Eris's prediction proved accurate. The swelling around his wound gradually subsided, and the greenish tint faded as his body neutralized the plant toxin. Each skin showed improving tissue condition and decreasing inflammatory markers. The Cthar observers, particularly Xyler and the students, watched this process with growing fascination. What had initially seemed like a reckless, primitive approach was demonstrating undeniable effectiveness. By the following day, Xyler requested a formal meeting with Eris in the medical bay. The instructor's posture was more open than usual, suggesting a significant shift in perspective. "Dr. Thorne," Xyler began, his voice modulated to indicate respect, "the medical data collected over the past cycle has prompted me to request a detailed explanation of human basic first aid techniques and principles. This appears to represent a significant gap in our understanding of human biological management." Eris nodded, recognizing the importance of this moment. "I would be happy to provide that information, instructor. Would you consider this an appropriate opportunity for educational exchange with your students as well?" "Indeed," Xyler agreed. "I have already informed them to attend. Your demonstration has become what you might call a case study of divergent approaches." Within an hour, the medical bay had been transformed into an impromptu classroom. Eris stood beside a three-dimensional anatomical hologram of a human body, which the Cthar had generated from their database. Lyra, Kale, and Rorik were positioned at the front of a small group of Cthar students and medical personnel, all displaying the characteristic stillness that indicated intense focus in their species. "Thank you for this opportunity," Eris began. "Today, I'll be discussing basic human first aid principles, with a focus on wound management and response to common environmental toxins." Using the hologram and examples from his own field experiences, Eris systematically explained the fundamentals. Human skin is our first line of defense, but unlike your exoskeletons, it's designed to be somewhat permeable and richly supplied with sensory nerves and blood vessels. This means minor breaches are common and generally non-threatening. He demonstrated the classification of common wounds, cuts, punctures, abrasions, and minor burns, and explained the body's natural healing mechanisms for each. For closed injuries like sprains or bruises, we follow a principle called RICE. Rest the injured area, apply ice to reduce swelling, use compression with bandages to support the tissues, and elevate the injured part above heart level, when possible, to reduce fluid accumulation. For open wounds, he detailed proper cleaning techniques, the importance of removing foreign materials, and various closure methods from simple bandaging to butterfly closures and sutures. Different types of sutures serve different purposes, he explained, showing various examples from his kit. Standard sutures need to be removed after healing, while self-dissolving ones, like I used, break down naturally as the tissue repairs itself. The Cthar students were particularly fascinated by his explanation of common allergic reactions and responses to natural toxins. Many plants and animals produce substances that can irritate human tissue. Our bodies typically respond with inflammation, redness, swelling, heat, and sometimes pain. This is actually a positive sign, showing that our immune system is actively responding. Eris carefully distinguished between localized reactions and systemic infections, explaining the warning signs that would indicate a need for more advanced intervention. Throughout his presentation, he showed them the contents of his first aid kit, explaining the purpose of each item: gauze, medical tape, antiseptic solutions, pain relievers, antihistamines, tweezers, small scissors, tools that the Cthar regarded with a mixture of fascination and disbelief at their apparent simplicity. The questions began hesitantly, but soon flowed freely. Lyra took meticulous notes, recording every detail with the thoroughness characteristic of her species. Kale repeatedly attempted to identify algorithmic patterns in what he called Eris's non-systematic approaches, seeming both frustrated and intrigued by the adaptability and judgment calls involved. Rorik posed increasingly complex hypothetical scenarios, testing the limits of basic first aid principles against extreme conditions. What if the toxin caused cellular disruption at the mitochondrial level? He challenged. Would your antihistamine still be sufficient? No, Eris admitted readily. That would require advanced medical intervention. First aid has clear limitations. It's designed for common injuries, not extreme scenarios. Knowing when more sophisticated help is needed is just as important as knowing how to apply basic techniques. This candid acknowledgement of limitations seemed to resonate with the Cthar students more than any of his explanations of techniques. Their species valued precise understanding of boundaries and thresholds. As the session concluded, Xyler approached Eris. Your insights have been illuminating, Dr. Thorne. I believe there may be unexplored value in these basic approaches, particularly when dealing with diverse biological systems. Eris nodded, recognizing the significant concession this represented from the normally rigid instructor. Advanced technology and simpler methods each have their place in a comprehensive approach to medical care. The exchange might have remained primarily theoretical, if not for an incident 3 days later. During a calibration procedure in the laboratory, a piece of equipment malfunctioned, sending a small shard of crystalline material flying through the air. By sheer unfortunate chance, it struck Lyra, slicing into the flexible membrane that connected sections of her exoskeleton on her auxiliary limb, the Cthar equivalent of an arm. Such injuries were relatively rare for the Cthar, as most of their vulnerable tissues were well protected by their rigid external covering. The standard protocol involved comprehensive scanning and laser sealing of the damaged membrane, a procedure that required specialized equipment and typically left the affected limb immobilized for several days during the sealing compound's curing process. Kale and Rorik immediately moved to assist Lyra toward the medical scanner, their movements conveying urgency. Wait, Eris said, looking to Xyler, who had also witnessed the incident. Instructor, would you permit me to suggest an alternative approach? Xyler's sensory nodules contracted and expanded rapidly, a sign of internal conflict. After a moment's consideration, he inclined his upper body slightly. Proceed with your suggestion, Dr. Thorne, but be prepared to defer to standard protocol if necessary. Eris approached Lyra, who was holding her injured limb carefully away from her body, a small amount of pale blue fluid seeping from a wound. Lyra, I believe we could adapt the first aid techniques I demonstrated to treat your injury effectively, he explained gently. It would be less invasive than the laser procedure and might allow faster healing and restoration of mobility. Would you be willing to try this approach? The young Cthar's sensory nodules quivered slightly, a sign of apprehension, but she inclined her body in the affirmative gesture of her species. I am curious to experience the comparative methodology, she said, her voice modulated to maintain scientific detachment despite her obvious discomfort. With careful guidance, Eris showed Lyra how to clean her own wound using a modified antiseptic solution that he had quickly formulated to be compatible with Cthar biochemistry. He then demonstrated how to apply precisely the right amount of pressure with a sterile dressing to stop the leakage of fluid without restricting circulation to the surrounding tissues. The key difference in our approach, he explained as he worked, is that instead of immediately sealing the wound with artificial materials, we're simply keeping it clean and supported while your body initiates its own repair mechanisms. Rather than stitches, which would have been inappropriate for the thin membrane tissue, Eris applied a special adhesive strip that would hold the edges of the wound together while remaining flexible enough to allow natural movement. This will protect the wound while still allowing circulation and natural healing, he told Lyra. You should be able to use your limb normally, though I'd recommend avoiding strenuous activity for about 2 days. Kale and Rorik watched the procedure with what Eris had come to recognize as the Cthar version of astonishment. The idea of treating such an injury without complex technological intervention seemed to challenge their fundamental understanding of medical care. Yet over the next few days, Lyra's wound healed remarkably well. The edges of the membrane joined seamlessly without the rigidity that often accompanied laser sealing, and she retained full mobility throughout the healing process. Most significantly, she required no downtime for recovery, a distinct advantage in the efficiency-focused Cthar culture. This practical demonstration proved more persuasive than any theoretical explanation could have been. Xyler called a formal meeting of the medical and research staff a week after the incident, with Eris and the 3 students as central participants. Recent events have prompted a re-evaluation of certain aspects of our medical methodology, Xyler announced, his tone carrying the formal resonance used for significant pronouncements in Cthar culture. While Cthar medical science remains at the forefront of technological advancement, Dr. Thorne's demonstration suggests that we have perhaps overemphasized complex interventions at the expense of simpler, yet potentially effective approaches for certain scenarios. The instructor turned to Eris. I am proposing a joint research initiative on comparative medical methodologies and biological adaptability, with you serving as primary consultant, Dr. Thorne. This project will explore the integration of what you term basic techniques with our advanced technologies, particularly for application in diverse biological contexts. Eris recognized the magnitude of this proposal. For a species as technologically oriented and protocol-driven as the Cthar, acknowledging value in seemingly primitive methods represented a significant paradigm shift. I would be honored to contribute to such research, Instructor Xyler, he replied formally. I believe this collaborative approach could yield valuable insights for both our species. The changes extended beyond formal research. In the days that followed, Eris noticed subtle but meaningful shifts in how the Cthar students interacted with him. Lyra approached him more frequently with questions, her initial timidity replaced by confident curiosity. She had begun carrying a small kit of basic supplies modeled after his own, adapting the contents for Cthar physiology. Kale, ever the systematizer, had commenced work on developing what he termed minimally invasive intervention algorithms, essentially decision trees for determining when simpler approaches might be more appropriate than complex technological solutions. He still struggled with the concept of intuitive judgment calls, but was making remarkable progress in quantifying the parameters for different intervention levels. Even Rorik had softened his skepticism. During a recent specimen collection expedition, he had surprised Eris by requesting a demonstration of field bandaging techniques adapted for Cthar appendages as a contingency preparation measure. For his part, Eris continued his original research work, but now with an additional dimension. The cultural exchange had evolved far beyond a simple sharing of scientific methodologies. It had become a bridge between fundamentally different approaches to problem solving. The Cthar tendency toward complex, technology-driven solutions and the human capacity for adaptive, resource-limited responses. 2 weeks after his surgical self-intervention, Eris sat in the laboratory, examining his hand. The small wound had healed completely, leaving only a faint, barely visible scar. It was a minor mark, yet it represented something significant, a moment of cultural collision that had transformed into mutual understanding. Across the laboratory, Zeiler was reviewing data on a holographic display, occasionally making notations with precise movements of his upper appendages. The instructor looked up, his sensory nodules orienting toward Eris in what the human had come to recognize as a gesture of acknowledgement. "Your tissue regeneration appears to have completed successfully, Dr. Thorne," Zeiler observed, his voice carrying a new harmonic that the translation system rendered as respectful approval. Eris smiled, flexing his hand. "Yes, all healed. Sometimes the body just needs a little help to do what it already knows how to do." Zeiler made a gesture that Eris had never seen the instructor use before, a complex movement that the cultural database later identified as signifying philosophical contemplation. "Perhaps," the Cathar scientist said after a moment, "that is a principle with wider application than we had previously considered. Even the most advanced civilizations may sometimes benefit from remembering the fundamental processes that brought them into being." Eris nodded, recognizing the profound insight behind the simple observation. As they returned to their respective work, the human and the alien researcher moved with a new synchronicity, representatives of vastly different worlds finding common ground in the most basic principle of all, the adaptability that made life itself possible. The small scar on Eris's hand would eventually fade completely, but the lessons learned from that unexpected injury would continue to influence both human and Cathar approaches to medicine and, perhaps, to life itself. A reminder that progress sometimes meant looking backward as well as forward, and that wisdom could be found in the most fundamental solutions.